The moment she raised the syringe, the father knew. Only one of them was walking out alive with the child. The blood pooled around his feet as the sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Mark Stevens stood frozen, his son clutched tightly against his chest, both of them trembling. This wasn't how love was supposed to end. This wasn't what he had signed up for when he'd swiped right on her profile 2 months ago. But as the red and blue lights began to flash against the walls of his modest suburban home, Mark realized that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings lead to the most devastating endings. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more emotional true stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support means everything, and I promise this journey is one you won't forget. 3 months earlier, Mark had been drowning. Not literally, but in every other sense of the word. At 34, he found himself a single father to 6-year-old Ethan after his wife Lisa's sudden death from an undiagnosed heart condition. The grief had been all-consuming, a constant companion that followed him from the moment he woke up alone in their bed to the second he closed his eyes at night, often with Ethan curled up beside him, both seeking comfort in each other's presence. Mark's days had fallen into a monotonous routine: wake up, get Ethan ready for school, go to his job as an architectural designer, pick Ethan up from after-school care, make dinner, help with homework, bedtime stories, and then collapse into exhaustion, only to repeat it all again the next day. His mother-in-law, Eleanor, had been a godsend, stepping in whenever she could, but she lived an hour away and had her own health issues to manage. "You need to start living again," Eleanor had told him one Sunday afternoon as they watched Ethan play in the backyard. "Lisa wouldn't want this for you, Mark. She wouldn't want you to shut yourself away from the world." Mark had nodded, not because he agreed, but because he was tired of arguing. How could he possibly think about dating again? About letting someone new into their lives? The very thought felt like a betrayal. But Eleanor was persistent. "Just create a profile. You don't even have to meet anyone. Just see what's out there. Remember what it feels like to connect with someone." So, on a particularly lonely night after Ethan had gone to bed, Mark had downloaded a dating app. He'd stared at the blank profile for nearly an hour before finally uploading a photo, one Lisa had taken of him at the beach last summer, smiling genuinely for the first time since her diagnosis. In his bio, he'd been brutally honest: single dad to an amazing 6-year-old boy. Widower still figuring out this new normal. Not looking for anything serious, just someone to talk to who understands that my son will always come first. 4 weeks, nothing happened. A few matches that fizzled out after a couple of messages. A coffee date with a woman who spent the entire time talking about her ex-husband. Mark was about to delete the app altogether when he received a message from Vanessa. Her profile picture showed a woman with warm brown eyes and a smile that seemed to radiate kindness. "I lost my husband 3 years ago," her message read. "I know exactly what you mean by new normal. It never really feels normal, does it?" Something about those simple words broke through the wall Mark had built around himself. They messaged back and forth for days, sharing stories about their lost spouses, about the challenges of grief, about the moments that still caught them off guard, like finding an old note or hearing a song that brought everything rushing back. Vanessa didn't have children of her own, but she worked as a pediatric nurse and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about Ethan. "He sounds like such a special boy," she'd written after Mark shared a story about Ethan's latest obsession with dinosaurs. "You're doing an amazing job with him, especially under such difficult circumstances." Their first meeting was at a park. Mark had brought Ethan along, wanting to be transparent from the beginning. If this woman was going to be part of his life in any capacity, she needed to understand that he and his son were a package deal. Vanessa had arrived with a small dinosaur figurine for Ethan and a coffee for Mark. "I remembered you said he loves the long-necked ones," she'd said, handing the Brachiosaurus to Ethan, who had been hiding shyly behind Mark's legs. By the end of the afternoon, Ethan was showing Vanessa his dinosaur roar and asking if she could come over to see his collection at home. Mark had felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since Lisa's death, he'd enjoyed someone's company without feeling guilty about it. The relationship progressed slowly, cautiously. Vanessa understood Mark's hesitation, never pushing for more than he was ready to give. She became a regular presence in their lives, coming over for dinner, joining them for movie nights, even helping Ethan with his reading homework when Mark had to work late. "She's not trying to replace Mom," Ethan had said one night as Mark tucked him into bed. "But I like having her around. She makes you smile again." Out of the mouths of babes. Mark hadn't realized how obvious his transformation had been, but Ethan was right. Vanessa had brought light back into their home, had reminded him that it was possible to feel joy again without diminishing the love he still held for Lisa. 2 months into their relationship, Mark invited Vanessa to stay the night for the first time. They'd had a wonderful evening, cooking dinner together while Ethan set the table, playing board games until Ethan's bedtime, and then sharing a bottle of wine on the couch, talking in low voices about their hopes for the future. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Mark had admitted, his fingers intertwined with hers. "After Lisa died, I was sure that part of my life was over." Vanessa had leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. "Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. I'm just grateful our paths crossed when they did." That night, as they lay together in the darkness of his bedroom, Mark had felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Maybe this was what moving forward looked like, not forgetting the past, but making room for new memories alongside the old ones. The next morning, Mark woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of Ethan's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. He found Vanessa and his son working together at the stove, Ethan standing on a chair as Vanessa guided his hand to flip a pancake. "We're making breakfast, Dad," Ethan had announced proudly. "Vanessa's teaching me how to make them in dinosaur shapes." Mark had stood in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. It felt right. It felt like family. But as the weeks passed, small inconsistencies in Vanessa's stories began to emerge. She'd mention a shift at the hospital, then later reference being somewhere else during that same time. She'd receive phone calls that she'd step outside to take, returning with vague explanations about work emergencies. Mark tried to ignore the nagging doubts. Everyone was entitled to their privacy, and he was probably just being paranoid. After all, trust issues were to be expected after experiencing such a profound loss. Then came the night that changed everything. Mark had been working late on a project deadline, and Vanessa had offered to pick Ethan up from his after-school program and stay with him until Mark got home. When he finally arrived, exhausted but grateful, he found Ethan already asleep and Vanessa curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. "Thank you for doing this," Mark had said, collapsing beside her. "I don't know what I would have done otherwise." Vanessa had smiled, leaning in to kiss him. "That's what partners do, right? They show up for each other." Partners. The word had sent a warm feeling through Mark's chest. Yes, that's what they were becoming. As they talked about their days, Mark mentioned that Eleanor had called, asking about Ethan's upcoming school play. "She's such a wonderful grandmother," Vanessa had commented. "Ethan told me all about their baking adventures last weekend." Mark had frozen. What baking adventures? The cookies they made together. The chocolate chip ones with the dinosaur shapes? Ethan said they spent the whole afternoon baking them at her house. A cold feeling had settled in Mark's stomach. "Vanessa, Eleanor's been in Arizona visiting her sister for the past 2 weeks. She hasn't seen Ethan since before we met you." The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa's expression had shifted, almost imperceptibly, before she'd laughed it off. "Oh, I must have misunderstood. You know how kids are with their stories. He probably meant someone else." But Ethan didn't know anyone else who baked with him. Lisa had been the baker in the family, and since her death, those traditions had fallen by the wayside. Eleanor had tried to keep them alive during her visits, but that was it. That night, after Vanessa had left with a flimsy excuse about an early shift, Mark had gone through Ethan's backpack, looking for any clues about what his son might have been talking about. What he found instead was a small notebook tucked into the front pocket, filled with childish handwriting that wasn't Ethan's. "Dear Ethan," one entry read. "I'm so excited for our special adventure tomorrow. Remember, it's our secret, just like we talked about. Don't tell Daddy yet because we want it to be a surprise for him too. I can't wait to show you your new home." Mark's blood had run cold. New home? Secret adventures? What was Vanessa planning? He'd immediately called Eleanor, waking her up in Arizona to confirm she hadn't been in touch with Ethan or authorized anyone to take him anywhere. Then he'd checked Ethan's room, relief washing over him at the sight of his son sleeping peacefully in his bed. The next morning, Mark had called in sick to work and kept Ethan home from school, claiming a stomach bug. He'd spent the day researching Vanessa online, trying to find any information about her. What he discovered, or rather, what he didn't discover, was alarming. There was no record of a Vanessa Reynolds working as a pediatric nurse at any hospital in the area. Her social media profiles all appeared to have been created within the last year, with minimal posts or connections. When Vanessa had texted asking how Ethan was feeling, Mark had replied casually, not wanting to raise suspicions. But internally, he was panicking. Who was this woman he had let into their lives? What did she want with his son? That evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Mark had called the police. The officer who took his report had been sympathetic but not particularly concerned. "Without any actual attempt at abduction, there's not much we can do," he'd explained. "But we'll definitely look into this woman's background and get back to you." Mark had barely slept that night, checking on Ethan repeatedly, jumping at every sound. The next day, he'd installed new locks on all the doors and windows and called a security company to set up a system. 3 days passed with no word from Vanessa. Mark had begun to wonder if perhaps he'd overreacted, if there was some innocent explanation for everything. Then the flowers had arrived, a beautiful arrangement with a card that read, "Missing my 2 favorite boys. Can't wait to see you both tomorrow. Love, V." Mark hadn't responded to the message, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to confront her directly, to demand answers. But another part, the protective father in him, feared what might happen if he did. The decision was made for him when, later that evening, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, Mark could see Vanessa standing on his porch, another small gift in her hands. He'd opened the door just enough to speak to her, keeping the security chain engaged. "Mark?" Vanessa's expression had been one of confusion. "Is everything okay? You haven't been answering my texts." "I think you should leave, Vanessa," Mark had said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I know you've been lying to me. About your job, about who you are. And I found the notebook in Ethan's backpack." The change in Vanessa's demeanor had been immediate and terrifying. Her warm smile had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You don't understand, Mark. Ethan needs me. You need me. We're supposed to be a family." "We are not a family," Mark had replied firmly. "Please leave now, or I'm calling the police." Vanessa's laugh had sent chills down his spine. "The police? And what will you tell them? That you invited a stranger into your home? That you left your precious son in my care multiple times? What kind of father does that make you, Mark?" Before he could respond, Ethan's voice had called out from behind him. "Dad? Is that Vanessa? Can she come in?" Mark had turned briefly to reassure his son, and in that moment of distraction, Vanessa had pushed against the door with surprising strength, breaking the security chain. What followed was a blur of motion and fear. Mark had grabbed Ethan, pushing him behind his body as Vanessa advanced into the house. In her hand was something Mark hadn't noticed before, a syringe. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Vanessa had said, her voice eerily calm. "I just need you to sleep for a little while, Mark. When you wake up, we'll be gone, and you can move on with your life." Ethan will be with someone who can truly care for him, who knows what he needs. Mark had backed away, keeping Ethan behind him as they moved toward the kitchen. "You're not taking my son anywhere," he'd said, reaching blindly behind him for anything he could use as a weapon. "I've been watching you for months, Mark," Vanessa had continued, still advancing slowly. "Long before I sent that first message. I know your routines, your weaknesses. I know that you're drowning, that you can barely keep it together. Ethan deserves better than a broken father who can't move past his grief." Mark's hand had closed around a knife on the counter. "Stay back," he'd warned, bringing the blade up between them. "Ethan, run to the neighbor's house. Now." But Ethan had been frozen in fear, clinging to Mark's leg. Vanessa had lunged forward then, the syringe aimed at Mark's neck. In the struggle that followed, the knife had sliced across Vanessa's arm, drawing a startled cry of pain from her. Blood had immediately begun to flow, spattering onto the kitchen floor. Vanessa had staggered backward, looking down at her arm in shock. "Look what you made me do," she'd whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen." Mark had used the moment to grab his phone from his pocket, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "I need help," he'd gasped into the phone. "There's an intruder in my home threatening my son." Vanessa's eyes had darkened with rage. "You're ruining everything," she'd hissed, lunging forward again. This time, Mark had been ready, sidestepping her attack and pushing her away from Ethan. Vanessa had slipped in her own blood, falling hard against the kitchen counter. The impact had knocked her unconscious, her body crumpling to the floor as more blood pooled beneath her. And that's where Mark now stood, his son clutched against his chest, both of them trembling as the sirens grew louder. The woman he thought he'd fallen in love with lay bleeding on his kitchen floor, and Mark had no idea who she really was or why she had targeted his family. The police arrived within minutes, followed closely by an ambulance. As the paramedics worked on Vanessa, the officers gently separated Mark and Ethan, taking them to different rooms to get their statements. "Her real name is Catherine Winters," the detective had explained later that night, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep in Eleanor's arms. Eleanor had driven straight from the airport after Mark's frantic call. "She's wanted in connection with 2 other cases of attempted child abduction in neighboring states. In both instances, she targeted single fathers with young children, integrated herself into their lives, and then disappeared with the children." "Were the children found?" Mark had asked, his voice barely audible. The detective's hesitation had been answer enough. "One was recovered after 3 months. The other, the search is ongoing." The revelation had left Mark reeling. How had he been so blind? How had he let this woman get so close to them? "You can't blame yourself," Eleanor had said later, after the police had left and the house had been processed as a crime scene. "She was a predator who knew exactly what she was doing. She targeted you because you were vulnerable, because you were trying to do the right thing for Ethan." But the guilt had eaten away at Mark nonetheless. For weeks after the incident, he'd barely slept, jumping at every sound, checking on Ethan multiple times throughout the night. Ethan had started having nightmares, calling out in his sleep, sometimes refusing to go to school out of fear that the bad lady would find him there. They'd started therapy, both individually and together, working through